We now have with us on the phone as well Chris Wallace, the anchor of Fox News Sunday, who has spent many hours, many months and years covering the Bush family and President Bush 41 in particular. Chris, your reaction to the news tonight and your memories.
Well, you know, there's an old thing we used to say about baseball players. We used to say that Ted Williams was the greatest living baseball player, and I have felt for some time that George H.W. Bush was the greatest living American, and we have lost him tonight. You know, I was just watching Brett's wonderful obituary, and the thing that is so extraordinary about it, one is how many things he did, you know, as Brett pointed out. Each chapter could have been a lifetime, but it was one chapter after another. And the thing that also really impressed me about George Bush's life is that he could have led a much easier life. He was the son of a very wealthy establishment family in Greenwich, Connecticut, and he's at Yale University, and he basically lies about his age so he can get into the Navy. And as Brett pointed out, he was the youngest Navy pilot, volunteer for his country, fly in the Pacific, get shot down, ends up going back to Yale. And then after he graduates, and again, his wife, Barbara, I'm looking at the pictures of the two of them together, was also from a very wealthy family in Connecticut, the Pierce family, and they could have had a very easy, cosseted life, living in New England, part of the establishment. Bush's father, Preston Bush, was a United States Senator. But no, he leaves, goes to a part of the country he really doesn't know at all, Texas, and becomes an oil man. And again, takes the hard road, not the easy road, and to make a name and a life for himself. And that was George H.W. Bush. One of the other things I think you need to point out, yes, he was a very gentle man. Yes, he was an extremely polished and great fun to be around. He was fiercely competitive, whether it was politics, whether it was a horseshoe game and the pitch he set up in back of the White House. He was a fighter. And when he lost to Bill Clinton in 1992, and of course this is just a year after he had presided over the enormous victory in the Gulf War over Saddam Hussein, so it was a huge disappointment. He was very hurt by it, but he picked himself up and led another full life after that.
He did. And Chris, we talk about the family, the closeness that they had, along with the competitiveness, but really the marriage between him and Barbara Bush, 73 years. It was the longest of any first couple in our country's history. And it was really unique. I mean, they were equals. She was not your traditional first lady in a lot of ways. And they always seemed to be having a great time together, to not only be spouses, but really be close friends and partners, and really each other's biggest cheerleaders.
Absolutely. And she was known as the Silver Fox. She had a tart tongue to a certain degree. She was the leader of the family because he was off pursuing his various adventures, whether it was in China or the CIA or a congressman or an oil man or whatever. And she was really the one, and he admitted it, who brought up the family. And they suffered a terrible loss. Their oldest child, Robin, a little girl, died of leukemia. And, you know, you see these pictures here of Barbara Bush. Her hair turned white at a very young age because this was just a terrible shock to them, the loss of their daughter. But they pulled themselves together, and you're right, they were very good friends. She knew how to deliver a zinger, and sometimes it was at her husband's expense, and nobody laughed more at it than he did, and it probably kept him grounded over the years.
Yeah, and definitely in defense of her family when it was necessary. We saw that side of her as well. And he was very, very supportive of her literacy efforts. I mean, something that she spent decades doing and became so well known for. And he often praised her for what she had accomplished and what she was doing after they left office, just as much as anything he'd ever done.
Yeah, and they both had this tremendous sense of people who have had the advantages that they had in life that you give back. She had her literacy program. He had his 1,000 points of light. And I remember when it first came out, when he was running for president in 1988, nobody quite knew what it meant. But what it meant was the idea that individuals could do acts of kindness, acts of generosity, give to other people, and really contribute to people's lives. And she, with the literacy program, interestingly, for a man who accomplished so much, there were two words that he hated. One was legacy. If you asked him, and I had the great good fortune to interview him as a vice president, as a presidential candidate in 1980 when he lost to Ronald Reagan as a president, and then as a former president. If you asked him about legacy, he didn't want to play on that. It was, the L word, he would call it, and he'd say, historians will decide that. I don't want to sit there and psychoanalyze and talk about what my legacy is. And the other word he didn't like very much was dynasty. And when you think about it, I mean, there were a lot of great American families, but there were two families that had two presidents in them, a father and a son, John Adams and John Quincy Adams, and George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush 43. And he didn't like that idea of dynasty either. He said, yes, we taught our children the idea of public service, but it wasn't necessarily to be in political service. There were all kinds of ways to serve, and didn't particularly like the idea of the Bush dynasty, although, of course, there was a Bush dynasty.
Yeah, and as we've talked about tonight, of course, when you become president, everything else on your resume sort of pales in comparison. But the fact that he was a very important envoy to China, that he headed up the CIA, I mean, he had such a varied background and so many things that he planted seeds that sprouted roots and grew into things down the line. When we think about major foreign policy accomplishments, I mean, that wasn't something new to him as vice president or president, Chris.
No, that's exactly right. Although, it's interesting. Brett talked about the fact that he was there when the wall fell, and that in 1989, and it was very interesting. I had the chance to interview him at the Bush Library, which is in College Station, part on the campus of Texas A&M. And one of the things that he talked about there was that this is November of 1989, and the wall fell, and there was a lot of push from some of his advisors. This was obviously a huge geopolitical victory. It was the end of the Cold War, for him to kind of puff up and say this was a great American victory. And he went against a lot of his advisors, and he said, no, we're not going to do that, because it's going to make, if we do that, it will come at the expense of Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the head of the Soviet Union still. And he said it will come at his expense, and it will make him harder to do his job. And what we want is not a victory dance so much as we want stability. And, how many politicians would sit there and not take the easy, obvious applause that he was going to get, but instead say, let's play this under the radar a bit so that we can make life easier for Mikhail Gorbachev, which will make it easier for him to withdraw and to keep his country together.